That night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, Harold told Ellen he wasn't buying anything new. She nodded and said she figured as much. Neither of them knew it then, but that decision, made in a barn that smelled of diesel and hay and 40 years of Wisconsin winters, would be the difference between keeping their land and losing it. 1983 was the year the farm crisis really started to show its teeth in the Midwest. It had been building for a while, slow and quiet like water rising behind a dam. Through the 1970s, farmland prices had climbed higher every year. In 1970, an acre of good Iowa farmland might sell for $600. By 1980, that same acre was worth $2,000, sometimes more. Farmers who had spent their whole lives being careful, who had been taught by their fathers to avoid debt and live within their means, started to believe that land was the one investment that would never fail. Banks believed it too. They encouraged borrowing. They told farmers that inflation would make today's debt cheaper tomorrow, that commodity prices would keep rising, that the boom would last. The government seemed to agree. Earl Butz, the Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon and Ford, had told farmers to plant fence row to fence row, to get big or get out, to borrow and expand because the world needed American grain. Exports to the Soviet Union were growing. Corn and soybean prices were strong. It felt like the future had finally arrived for rural America, and anyone who didn't jump on board was going to be left behind. Harold Mathison had watched all of this happen from his 240 acres in Dane County. He milked 60 head of Holsteins twice a day, the same way his father had, the same way his grandfather had before rural electrification made it easier. He grew his own feed corn and hay, rotated his pastures, fixed his equipment in the machine shed with tools that had been in the family since before the Depression. When neighbors started buying new tractors, new combines, new planters with all the latest features, Harold kept using what he had. When they started renting more land and taking out loans to buy additional acreage, Harold stayed put. It wasn't that he lacked ambition. He just didn't trust the numbers. He remembered what his father had told him in 1955, after they had finally paid off the mortgage that had nearly taken the farm during the 1930s. His father had said that debt was a noose that felt loose until it tightened, and that the only real security in farming was owning your ground free and clear. Harold had believed him then, and he believed him now. Ellen felt the same way. She kept the books, managed the household accounts, and knew to the penny what they could afford and what they couldn't. She had grown up on a farm that went under in 1961, watched her father sell off the cattle and the equipment and moved to town to work at the feed mill. She had promised herself she would never let that happen to her own family. But by 1983, that kind of thinking had started to look old-fashioned. The Mathisons' neighbors were doing well, or at least it seemed that way. The Hendersons had bought a new four-wheel drive tractor the year before, a massive green machine that cost more than $60,000. They had financed it over 7 years at 14% interest, but grain prices were high and the tax deduction helped. The Kowalskis had added 320 acres to their operation, borrowing against their existing land to make the down payment. The Jensens had built a new machine shed with a concrete floor and electric heat, something Harold would never have considered. At church on Sundays, the talk was about expansion, investment, the need to compete with the big operations that were starting to appear in other parts of the country. A few people, always politely, suggested that Harold was being too conservative, that he was missing opportunities, that his kids would inherit a farm too small to be viable in the modern era. Harold listened and didn't argue. He went home and kept working the way he always had. Then, in the summer of 1981, Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, decided to break the back of inflation. Interest rates, which had been high for years, went even higher. The prime rate hit 20%. Farm loans that had been taken out at 8 or 10% came due and had to be refinanced at 15, 18, sometimes 20%. At the same time, the value of the dollar began to rise against foreign currencies, making American grain more expensive on the world market. Exports started to fall. The Soviet grain deal, which had been one of the pillars of the export boom, slowed down after the United States imposed a partial embargo following the invasion of Afghanistan. Commodity prices, which had been strong for most of the 1970s, started to weaken. Corn that sold for $3.50 a bushel in 1980 was down to $2.40 by 1982. Soybeans dropped even harder. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to expand suddenly found themselves paying high interest on debt that had been based on inflated land values and optimistic price projections. The cash flow wasn't there. The equity was disappearing. And the banks, which had been so eager to lend just a few years earlier, started to get nervous. Harold watched it unfold with a sick feeling in his stomach. He knew most of these people. They weren't reckless. They weren't fools. They had done what everyone told them to do, what the banks and the government and the agricultural economists had all said was smart business. They had believed in the future, invested in their farms, tried to build something for their children. Now they were caught. The Hendersons, with their new tractor, were struggling to make the payments. The Kowalskis couldn't refinance their land loan at a rate they could afford, and the bank was starting to ask hard questions. The Jensens had stopped talking about expansion and started talking about survival. At the feed mill in town, the conversations were getting quieter, more tense. People stopped bragging about their operations and started asking each other if they had heard anything about loan extensions or government relief programs. In 1983, 3 farms in the county went into foreclosure. In 1984, it was 8. By 1985, it was 15. The auctions were brutal. Families who had worked the same land for generations stood in their own driveways and watched strangers bid on their equipment, their livestock, everything they had built. The auctioneers tried to keep things moving, keep the mood light, but there was no hiding what was happening. This wasn't creative destruction or market efficiency. This was the dismantling of a way of life. Ellen Mathison went to one of those auctions in the spring of 1985. It was the Henderson place, just 4 miles down the road. She had known Margaret Henderson since grade school. They had been in the same 4-H club, attended the same country church, raised their children in the same small community. Now Margaret stood near the barn, her face blank, while men in work coats examined her husband's machinery. The 4-wheel drive tractor, barely 3 years old, sold for less than half what they had paid for it. The dairy herd went for rock-bottom prices because everyone knew the market was flooded with cattle from liquidating farms. The land itself, 200 acres that had been in the Henderson family since the 1880s, sold to an investor from Illinois who planned to rent it out. Ellen watched the whole thing, and when it was over, she drove home and sat in the truck in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. That night she told Harold she was grateful, more grateful than she could say, that they had stayed out of debt. Harold nodded and said he wished everyone could have. The 1980s were a hard education in economic reality for rural America. The farmers who survived were generally the ones who had avoided the leverage trap, who had kept their operations small enough to manage without constant borrowing, who had been willing to look out of step with the times. Harold and Ellen Mathison were among them. They still milked 60 head. They still farmed 240 acres. They still used equipment that made the John Deere dealer shake his head in disbelief. But they didn't owe anyone a dime, and in a time when that mattered more than anything else, it kept them alive. Their kids still had to help with chores before school. Ellen still darned socks and made her own bread and drove a truck that was 12 years old. Harold still patched tires and rebuilt starters and did without things that other people considered necessities. But the farm was theirs. The land was theirs. And when the worst of the crisis finally started to ease in the late 1980s, they were still standing. By 1991, things had begun to stabilize. Land prices had bottomed out and were starting to recover, though they would never again see the speculative heights of the late 70s. Interest rates had come back down to more reasonable levels. Commodity prices were still low, but they were consistent, and farmers who had made it through the crisis had learned to operate on thinner margins. The big shakeout was over. Thousands of farms had been lost, entire communities had been hollowed out, and the rural Midwest looked different than it had a decade earlier. But for those who remained, there was a cautious sense that the worst had passed. Harold was 58 years old that year, and he was thinking about the future in a way he hadn't allowed himself to think in a long time. He and Ellen had 3 children. The oldest, Tom, had gone to college and become an engineer. The middle child, Sarah, was teaching school in Milwaukee, but the youngest, David, had always loved the farm. He had stayed close, worked construction during the week and helped with chores on weekends, and made it clear that he wanted to take over someday. Harold wanted that too, but he knew the operation was too small to support two families, let alone provide a decent living for the next generation. If David was going to make a go of it, the farm needed to be bigger. That spring, Harold heard that the old Schultz place was going up for sale. 300 acres, good soil, nice flat ground that bordered the Mathison farm on the east side. The Schultz family had sold out during the crisis, and the land had changed hands twice since then. Now it was being offered by a bank that had taken it back in a foreclosure. The asking price was $1,200 an acre, which was about right for the market at that time, maybe even a little low. $360,000 total. It was more money than Harold had ever seriously considered spending on anything, but it was also an opportunity that might not come again. He talked it over with Ellen for weeks. They went through the numbers over and over, looked at their savings, tried to figure out what it would take. They had been frugal for their entire marriage, saved what they could, avoided unnecessary expenses. By 1991, they had $190,000 in the bank. It wasn't enough to buy the land outright, but it was close. Harold went to the bank in Madison, the same bank he had done business with for 30 years. He sat down with a loan officer, a man about his own age who had seen the whole farm crisis play out from behind a desk. Harold explained what he wanted to do. He said he could put down $190,000 in cash, and he needed to borrow the remaining $170,000. The loan officer looked at the numbers, looked at Harold's financial history, and then asked a question that Harold had been expecting. He wanted to know why Harold hadn't expanded during the boom years, why he had stayed so small when everyone else was growing. Harold didn't get defensive. He just said that he hadn't trusted the market, hadn't wanted to take on debt he couldn't control. The loan officer nodded slowly and said that was probably the smartest thing he had heard a farmer say in 20 years. He approved the loan that afternoon. The terms were reasonable, the interest rate was manageable, and for the first time in his life, Harold Mathison owed money to a bank. But this time felt different. He wasn't borrowing to speculate or to keep up with the neighbors. He was borrowing because he could afford to, because the farm could support the payment, and because he was building something for his son. The purchase closed in June of 1991. Harold and Ellen wrote a check for $190,000. The bank covered the rest, and the Mathison farm went from 240 acres to 540 acres overnight. It was the single biggest decision Harold had ever made, and for a few weeks, he barely slept. He kept running the numbers in his head, kept worrying that he had waited too long, that he should have stayed conservative, that he had broken the one rule his father had drilled into him about avoiding debt. But Ellen reminded him that this was different. They weren't gambling, they were planning, and they had earned the right to take this step because they had been patient when everyone else was reckless. David moved back to the farm that fall and started working full-time. Together, he and Harold expanded the dairy herd to 120 head, increased the feed corn acreage, and began the slow process of making the new land productive. It was hard work, the kind of work that didn't leave room for doubt or second-guessing, and that was probably a good thing. By 1995, the loan was half paid off. By 2000, it was gone completely. Harold was 67 years old by then, slowing down but still working every day. David had taken over most of the daily operations, and the farm was doing well. Land prices were climbing again, but this time the rise felt steadier, less speculative. The memories of the 1980s were still sharp, and people were more careful. The Mathison farm, which had once been too small and too old-fashioned to take seriously, was now one of the more stable operations in the county. The equipment was still old, still patched together with baling wire and ingenuity, but it ran. The land was paid for. The family was intact. And when Harold drove past the spot where the Henderson farm used to be, where Margaret and her husband had lost everything because they believed what the banks and the experts told them, he felt a complicated mix of relief and sadness. Relief that his own family had been spared. Sadness that so many others had not. There is a story that gets told sometimes in Dane County, usually by older farmers who remember the crisis. It is about the day the John Deere dealer came out to the Mathison place in 1983 and told Harold his equipment was junkyard material, then made the mistake of suggesting that Harold's wife might talk some sense into him. People like to say that Ellen never forgot that comment, that it stuck with her through all the hard years that followed, and that when Harold bought the Schultz land in 1991, she made sure to remind him of it. Whether that is exactly true is hard to say. Ellen passed away in 2003, and Harold followed her in 2007. But David Mathison, who still runs the farm today, says his mother did have a long memory, especially when it came to people who underestimated her or her husband. He says that when they paid cash for most of that 300 acres, putting down nearly $200,000 in savings, it felt like vindication. Not because they wanted to prove anything to the dealer or the neighbors or anyone else, but because they had trusted themselves when everyone else was telling them to trust the system, and it had made all the difference. The lesson in all of this is not that debt is always bad, or that expansion is always dangerous. Plenty of farmers borrowed money and thrived. Plenty of operations grew successfully during the boom years and managed to survive the bust. But the crisis of the 1980s revealed a truth that is easy to forget during good times. It showed that the advice of experts, the encouragement of institutions, and the behavior of peers are not always reliable guides. It showed that markets can turn, that assumptions can be wrong, and that the future is never as certain as it seems. The farmers who made it through were not necessarily smarter or harder working than the ones who didn't, but they were more skeptical. They were more cautious. They were willing to be out of step with the times because they trusted their own judgment more than they trusted the crowd. Harold and Ellen Mathison were those kinds of people. They didn't make dramatic speeches or take bold stands. They just quietly did what made sense to them, kept their operation small and manageable, avoided debt they couldn't control, and waited. And when the smoke cleared and the crisis was over, they were still there, still farming, still building something that would last. Today, the Mathison farm is still in the family. David runs it with his own son, Harold's grandson, who is learning the same lessons about patience and discipline and the danger of believing that good times will last forever. The dairy herd is gone now, replaced by cash crops and some contract farming arrangements. The equipment is newer, though David still keeps that old 1958 John Deere 720 in the corner of the barn, mostly for sentimental reasons. The land is worth far more than it was in 1991, but that is just numbers on paper. What matters is that the farm survived when so many others did not, and that it survived because two people made a choice in 1983 to ignore the pressure, resist the trend, and trust their own instincts. The dealer who called that tractor junkyard material probably forgot about the Mathisons within a week, but the Mathisons never forgot him. And years later, when they paid cash for most of 300 acres, bought with savings accumulated through decades of discipline and restraint, it must have felt like the quietest, most satisfying victory imaginable. So, what can we take from this? What does it mean for those of us who are trying to navigate our own economic decisions, our own moments of pressure to conform, our own temptations to believe that this time is different? Maybe it means that the courage to stand apart is often more valuable than the courage to go along. Maybe it means that the opinions of salesmen, experts, and even neighbors are less important than the quiet voice of experience and common sense. Maybe it means that the future belongs not to those who chase every opportunity, but to those who recognize which opportunities are real and which are illusions. Or maybe it just means that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is nothing at all. To keep your head down, do your work, avoid the noise, and trust that patience and discipline will be rewarded in the end. Harold and Ellen Mathison believed that. They lived it, and when the crisis came, it saved them. How many of us, in our own lives, are willing to make that same bet? How many of us have the strength to be called old-fashioned, out of touch, too cautious, and to keep going anyway? And when the advice of the world turns out to be wrong, as it so often does, will we be the ones left standing? Or will we be the ones at the auction, watching strangers bid on everything we built?